Today we'll be looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Mr. Charles and Mrs. Eva Herman lived at number 23 Blossom Alley in Buffalo in New York. Both had come to the United States from Germany some years earlier, settling in the city, hoping to find a more stable and hopeful future than the one they had left behind. In the second part of the 19th century, Buffalo's German section was one of the most prominent neighborhoods. It was centered along Broadway, Genesee and Main Streets, where many German families had established their homes, churches and businesses. Large numbers of immigrants had begun arriving in Buffalo in the 1830s and 1840s, driven by political unrest in Europe, economic hardship, and the hope of better opportunities. They found work as brewers, bakers, butchers, and other skilled trades, and their shops and workshops became a defining feature of the district. By the 1880s, the German community was firmly settled, with its own newspapers, churches and schools, forming a distinct and recognizable part of the city's life. Charles and Eva rented the second floor of a neat two-story brick house at 23 Blossom Alley. On the floor below them lived their landlady, a lady named Mrs. Lucy Newnold, an elderly woman who was very well known in the German part of the city. Life within the household of Charles and Eva, however, was not as harmonious as it might have appeared from the outside. For several years their marriage had been deeply strained, and although Charles had previously worked as a butcher, for some time he had been unemployed and spent most of his days idle, while his wife Eva went out to work, attending a small fruit stand for a man named Christopher Ziegler in one of Buffalo's public markets. She was a very conscientious worker and very mindful of her responsibilities at home, aware that she needed an income in order to ensure that all her rent and bills were paid. Despite her efforts, much of the money she earned was spent by her husband Charles on alcohol, and when he drank, he became jealous and would often tell her that her employer, Mr. Ziegler, was far too familiar, and this led to their home life being dominated by frequent quarrels, which often became loud and bitter, and sometimes turned violent. Neighbours had become used to these disturbances, and by 1885 it seemed that peace in the household had long since given way to anger and resentment. On Wednesday, the 4th of November, Mrs. Newnold had grown worried, as she had not seen Eva for a few days. She remembered the heated argument upstairs on Sunday the 1st of November, but since then the house had been unusually quiet. Charles had been coming and going as usual, yet there was no sign of his wife, and her absence felt very strange. When Charles left the house once again that morning, Mrs. Newnold decided to find out what was going on. She went to their rooms and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She tried to open it, but it was locked. Not to be deterred, she forced it open and was confronted by a grim sight. Eva lay dead on the bed. Her throat had been cut. Mrs. Newnold immediately raised the alarm, and police arrived shortly afterwards. The scene that met them inside the small upstairs apartment was one of horror. There was a lot of blood on the floor, and the body of Mrs. Herman was lying lifeless, with signs of a violent struggle very evident. Officers questioned Mrs. Newnold, who stated that she had always regarded Mrs. Herman as a respectable, hard-working woman, but that Mr. Charles Herman was little more than a drunken brute, known for his quarrels and unsteady habits. News of the death of Mrs. Herman soon spread across the neighborhood, causing a mix of shock and speculation. Many neighbors believed that Mr. Herman had killed his wife early that morning and then fled. Others, however, thought it more likely that the poor unfortunate woman, weary of her situation and disheartened by life with a drunken husband, had died by her own hand. For a time, these conflicting views circulated freely, adding confusion to an already distressing case. The uncertainty was finally resolved by Dr. Edwards, who conducted a post-mortem examination. His findings put an end to the speculation. He determined that Mrs. Herman had been dead for approximately 90 hours, as her body had already begun to decompose. After examining the position in which she was found, and the placement of the razor on the floor near the bed, he concluded that it would have been impossible for her to have inflicted the wound herself. Her death, therefore, could only be regarded as murder. Police realised that it was very important that they contact Charles Herman, so law enforcement across the city was put on alert, and a description of him was circulated to police stations throughout Buffalo. Patrolmen and detectives were instructed to be on the lookout, with particular attention to the neighbourhoods Mr. Herman was known to frequent. Despite the wide search, several hours passed before a trace of him was found. He was finally located at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the Terrace Saloon on Pearl Street through the vigilance of an off-duty police officer named Joseph Wright, who had at one time lived in the same house as Mr. Herman and was aware of the bars that he liked to visit. When he was found, Mr. Herman was in a state of intoxication, so after sending word to Captain Kavanagh and Sergeant Kennedy, Officer Wright took him into custody. He was brought before Superintendent Hill and told that he had been arrested in connection with the murder of his wife, Mrs. Eva Herman. However, Mr. Herman seemed shocked and denied any knowledge of his wife's death. When he was no longer drunk, he was shown the razor that the police believed had been used in the attack, and he identified it as his. He also admitted to wiping his hands on a blood-stained cloth which had been found at the scene, but despite this, he continued to claim that he had not committed the act and questioned the reported position of the body when found. In the meantime, officers had taken a statement from the landlady, Mrs. Newnold, who had told them that Mr. Herman had been coming and going from the house since Sunday night and consistently returning at around 11 o'clock. The police suspected that the murder had occurred on the Sunday evening, while Mrs. Newnold was away at church. They believed that after killing his wife, Mr. Herman had left the house and upon returning, gone straight back to his room. They had also concluded that on the Monday and Tuesday nights, he again went out, returning late in a drunken state, and therefore for 3 consecutive nights, he had slept in the same bed as his dead wife and seemed oblivious or indifferent to the horror that had lain beside him. After spending a night in custody, Mr. Herman was subjected once again to intensive questioning by the police. Under continued pressure, he eventually admitted to the officers that on Sunday the 1st of November, his wife had informed him that she was going out, but had refused to disclose her destination, a refusal that had enraged him. He said that overcome by anger, he then flung her to the floor, and in a moment of madness, he drew a razor from his pocket and inflicted the fatal gash across her throat. He added that the defensive cuts on her hands and scratches on her neck were due to the desperate struggle she had made to save herself. He went on to say that he then placed her on the bed and locked the room before leaving the house and going to a bar where he started drinking. He said that when he returned later, he went straight to the room and slept in the bed, claiming that he did not know if his wife had died and made no effort to find out, as he believed that she was just angry with him. His story was met with disbelief, as evidence in the house told a different tale. Investigators had concluded that the body had remained where it had fallen on the floor and was not placed on the bed until the Monday, which contradicted Mr. Herman's accounts, but still highlighted the grim reality of his actions. This statement, along with the landlady's observations, were further confirmed by Superintendent Phillips, who questioned Mr. Herman again. During this interrogation, Mr. Herman repeated, in a very clear manner, that he had killed his wife on the Sunday evening, between 7 and 8 o'clock, because she had refused to tell him where she was going when she wanted to leave the house. Following this, he was formally charged with the murder of Eva Herman, and an inquest was held to examine the circumstances surrounding her death. After hearing all the evidence, the jury concluded that Charles Herman was guilty of having unlawfully killed his wife and recommended that he be brought for trial for the crime. The trial began on the 21st of December before Judge Daniels. More than 100 jurors were questioned before 12 impartial men could be chosen. Mr. Herman was represented by Leroy Andrus. The first witness was the coroner, Mr. Scott, who testified that he had called at the property at number 23 Blossom Alley at around 9:30 in the morning on Wednesday the 4th of November. He said that there he saw the body of a woman in the apartment that was rented by Charles and Eva Herman, and on inspection he discovered that her throat had been cut. He told the court that the body was partially covered with bedding and blood was found on the carpet and the dead woman's clothing. Somewhat remarkably, it was at that point that an objection was raised by the defence counsel. Mr. Leroy Andros addressed the judge and said that he objected to any testimony about blood, since no scientific test appeared to have been made to confirm that it was actually blood found in the room. The judge, looking somewhat bemused, turned to Coroner Scott and asked if he was able to distinguish between bloodstains and red paint, to which the coroner replied that he was, and the objection was then overruled. Dr. Edward Clark, who conducted the post-mortem, was the next witness. He described the wounds he found on Mrs. Herman's body and said that the cuts had been made with a sharp instrument and that death had been caused by hemorrhage. When the court reconvened the next morning, the crowd outside had grown so large that officers were forced to turn many spectators away. However, inside the courts, the room was filled with eager anticipation as those present wondered what the day's proceedings might reveal. The first witness was Mrs. Lucy Newnold, the elderly owner of the house at number 23 Blossom Alley. She spoke only broken English, so her testimony was taken through an interpreter. She explained the layout of the rooms occupied by the Hermans and told of how Mrs. Herman used to earn money by taking in washing, but later she found work on a fruit stand at the market. She said that about 1 week before the crime, she had ordered Mr. Herman out of the house because he had been drinking heavily. However, instead of leaving quietly, he went into the yard in a fit of temper, bent down, and picked up a fragment of brick that had been lying near the fence. He then held it in his hand and raised his arm in order to make a motion, as though he meant to hurl it through the window towards the room where Mrs. Herman and Mrs. Newnold were seated. She said that at the time the gesture caused alarm, though the brick was never actually thrown. The defence objected to this, claiming the incident was too remote and irrelevant. However, the judge permitted the testimony to be admitted. During the cross-examination, Mr. Herman's attorney adopted a line of questioning that struck many in court as peculiar. Instead of keeping to the central facts of the crime, he instead pressed the witness on a host of minor points, such as the number of rooms in the house, the position of the doors and windows, the age of the building, the sort of locks and keys that were in use, and even the frequency in which Mrs. Newnold attended church. These digressions seemed to puzzle the jury and drew more than one impatient glance from the bench. It appeared that the defence were carefully trying to construct a strategy that cast doubt on Mr. Herman's mental state at the time of the crime. They seemed intent in presenting the possibility that he might have been suffering from a form of insanity, or at the very least, a severe psychological disturbance that would have impaired his judgment and understanding of his actions. Central to this argument was the notion that his confession, so pivotal in the prosecution's case, may not have been a clear and voluntary admission of guilt. Instead, it could have been prompted by fear, confusion, or an overwhelming sense of mental instability. By highlighting these factors, the defence sought to suggest that Mr. Herman's statements should not be taken at face value, and that the court ought to question whether his mind had been capable of rational thoughts or coherent decision-making when he said that he had committed the crime. In doing this, they aimed not merely to undermine the confession itself, but to raise broader questions about his culpability, framing the case as one of psychological fragility rather than one of deliberate criminal intent. However, Dr. Floyd Kriego, who had examined Mr. Herman, told the court that he considered him to be of sound mind. The defence decided against putting Mr. Herman on the witness stand, and the trial concluded on the 28th of December. The following day, after deliberating for 20 hours, the jury returned and declared that they found the defendant, Mr. Charles Herman, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge then sentenced him to be hanged on the 12th of February. An appeal was made to Governor Hill, but after reviewing the evidence, he declined to interfere. The fate of Mr. Herman was sealed, and preparations were made for his execution. In the week before he was due to be hanged, the newspapers again wrote about the case and described Mr. Herman as a poor, degraded man who took the life of a woman who had cared for him for many years, supported him, and even provided the money that he had wasted on drink. They wrote that he had a hardened nature, and that it was probably due to this that he was able to commit an act so horrible that it is almost too unbearable to recall, namely that he slept for 3 nights in the same bed as the body of the wife that he had murdered. Yet when the moment of his punishment finally arrived, there was a strange, almost unsettling sense of pity. As he stood on the scaffold, the recollection of what he had done seemed to press down upon him. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for a fleeting instant, he appeared less a figure of horror than one of human frailty. Somehow, an individual caught between the enormity of his crime and the inevitability of its consequence. Then, without further ceremony, the trapdoor was released, and Charles Herman was hanged, his final moments passing in silence, leaving only the reality that justice had been served. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case